Alafia. I'm Dr. Gloria Lattimore Peace, host and producer of OmniU Presents the H3O Art of Life show. And I'm here today with a guest from the University of Illinois at Chicago, who along with Dr. Amanda E. Lewis, Dr. Yvonne Arenas, and Deanna G. Lewis, is the author of a report called A Tale of Three Cities, The State of Racial Justice in Chicago, which is a recent report released by the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Dr. Casey Henricks.
Thank you for having me.
I'm very happy to have you and very fortunate to have you because my understanding is that in fall of 2017, you're going to the University of Tennessee.
I am. It's going to be a homecoming. I grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and I will be joining the sociology department there. So I'm looking forward to going back, but I will indeed miss Chicago.
Well, I'm happy that you're here so we can have this discussion. You're a sociologist and a socio-legal scholar. Tell me something about socio-legal.
Sure. So I have a training in socio-legal studies. I was a fellow at the American Bar Foundation. And part of the socio-legal approach is really just coming to law understanding that it's socially embedded, right? Rather than looking at law from a doctrinal point of view, as if those words kind of appear from nowhere, and that you have strict interpretations of the law, a socio-legal approach really tries to contextualize it within the social circumstances that are at play and within the power dynamics that are there as well.
Okay, so what told you to go into that field?
You know, it was happenstance. In a lot of ways, I fell into it. I came to Chicago wanting to study how racial inequality works, and part of the reason for why I was applying to schools in the Chicago area was a lawsuit was initiated by the Chicago Urban League back in, I want to say, 2007, 2008. And it was a suit that was brought about against the Illinois State Board of Education. And they were basically making a claim that there were civil rights violations that were occurring in the state of Illinois, particularly within the city of Chicago. And they were identifying an old narrative that academics have talked about for decades, that de facto disparities within districts by wealth reproduces de facto disparities, inequalities in terms of what education funding is available. So I was interested in, well, that whole process, but also thinking, well, that's not an argument that's necessarily new. How can I bring something to the table that kind of supplements the lawsuit that they have, but talk about it in a new way? And I originally came to studying socio-legal work by way of the Illinois Lottery. I thought about the lottery in terms of, well, that's one way to talk about education finance within the state of Illinois, within the context of these de facto disparities that are being reproduced that isn't necessarily addressed a whole lot. So one thing led to another, and the lotteries got me really interested in focusing on tax law and state finance. So somehow I found myself at the American Bar Foundation a few years later, not necessarily planning it that way, but that's how it turned out.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because I find this very interesting that you're co-author of a book called State Looteries. I love it. State Looteries, Historical Continuity, Rearticulations of Racism and American Taxation. What a title. Tell me something about that. You didn't bring me one of those.
Sorry about that.
I'll just ask you to tell me something about it before I go out to find my own copy.
Sure, sure. Well, I can tell you something about the title specifically. Like, that was actually one of those serendipitous things that came out of a typo in Microsoft Word. You know, in Microsoft Word, whenever you're typing and you have a misspelling, you have like a little red squiggly line that comes underneath it. And I happened to spell lotteries as looteries. And then, like, whenever I was looking back to it, I was like, wait, that really captures the whole process of what I'm talking about. Yeah, precisely. But I try to talk about lotteries in a different way than a lot of academics talk about it, by putting it in a racialized context. You know, if we go back in time 50 years ago, lotteries basically didn't exist in America. There's something that's so familiar now. I mean, we see, you know, ads on WGN, we see ads on billboards. I mean, it pervades our everyday life. It's everywhere. but those familiar things would have been strange a half century ago. So I basically traced the origination of lotteries coming out 50 years ago, looking at, well, they really actually had origination in anti-busing movements. Once you had like normative changes in how people, how white folks in particular, could resist or talk, well, basically you would have changes in, excuse me, can we cut real quick?
No, you don't have to cut out. What I'll do is fill that in while you're collecting your thought on that. What I need to fill you in on is because I'm an aged person and have long experience, particularly in the city of Chicago. Lotteries mimic something that was going on in the black community much longer than 50 years ago. It was called the numbers racket in parts of the country, and other parts of the country, as in Chicago, it was called policy. And it was not designed to fund schools or do anything other than to relieve some of the deprivation and poverty that existed in black communities. And so there were numbers that people could wager on. They could pay small amounts of money, give it to a certain person who was considered the runner, who would then take those numbers, and then I suppose they spin a roulette wheel or something, and they choose the numbers, and if you have chosen the right numbers, then you win a pot of money. But all this money came from the people who played the numbers or played the policy. After a while, this was just being done in the community. After a while, you started to get the organized crime element in there, where they would do things that are referred to as muscle in. And they come in and start demanding to be paid off to allow these numbers games to continue. Eventually, there were murders and mayhem associated with this, and eventually it was completely suppressed and outlawed and could no longer be practiced in the community, and voila, it turned into the lottery.
Right.
The very thing that was declared illegal, the very thing over which people lost their lives, suddenly became legal and acceptable, and in every storefront that you can imagine to be, and the excuse was, or the justification was, that it could be used to fund schools.
Right.
So that's the backstory of the lootery.
Right.
Right.
It's a nice racial underbelly of how state lotteries operate. In some ways, in Illinois, you know, whenever the lottery was first initiated in the late 70s, it didn't start off within this state as a boom to finances. It wasn't generating that much money at all. But it wasn't until they looked back to those old games that were being played in mostly black communities, policy, numbers, and they reintroduced in the early 80s what we now know of today as Pick 3, your lucky numbers game. Like, you're exactly right. Like, those games are modeled exactly off of what was going on in those communities. And then you start seeing an explosion of revenues in terms of what money is being generated from the lottery. I mean, the Illinois lottery now generates about $2 billion per year. A third of that revenue goes to education. But I would also like to point out that, putting this in broader scheme, those lottery dollars, while they were put in place on the promise that they were actually going to supplement education and add additional funds to our schools and our children, what has actually happened is that they've substituted for tax revenues that are no longer there.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of gets back to what I was mentioning earlier, where you had, like, during the 1960s and 70s, you had these anti-busing movements, right? Well, really,
Mm-hmm.
it's going back to the 50s. But whenever it was no longer feasible to talk about race in explicit, overt terms for white folks, they transitioned into more colorblind rhetoric, and they redirected their goals from anti-busing to anti-tax movements, because they were resistant to have their public dollars go to what they saw as a private disaster. So they implemented a variety of tax limitation policies and basically cut off what revenue could be generated from property taxes. So the lottery was brought in to basically fill that void. And in doing so, it's no mystery in terms of who actually plays the lottery, right? It's working class folks, folks who have less education, folks of color. So what that has actually done is redistributed the tax liability of who actually pays for public schools in the state of Illinois and Chicago.
Well, now that's eye-opening, and I certainly didn't expect to get that little perk, but I certainly appreciate it, and I certainly appreciate the tale of three cities, which I, for the purposes of this show, have reframed as the Chicago, a tale of 2.5 cities. And I actually thought of some other things. One of the things I thought about is when former President Barack Obama said, you know, there's one America, there is no black America, there's no white America, there's only the United States of America. Well, apparently there are 3 Americas. But then when I started thinking about it again, since we're talking about cities, you know, cities within a city, it occurred to me that a better way to look at the black portion of the 3 cities is to look at what Eugene Perkins looked at in 1975 in a book called Home is a Dirty Street, The Social Oppression of Black Children, in which he defined the communities that black people inhabit as ghetto colonies. Get colonies was the final resolution of that term. So he saw the black community as a colony. And when you think about what a city is, then you know that a city has boundaries. You know, it has its north. You go so far, and then you're no longer in Chicago, and then you go so far in the opposite direction, and the same thing is true east and west. So you can, you know, you have latitude and longitude. You can locate Chicago on a map. When you look at the places that black people occupy, you see that they live not in a city that shares in the bounty or lack thereof of the city, but they are kind of a settlement, a little place set aside where you can dole out things or withdraw things. And so some of the things that you're talking about here, and I'm so glad you're looking at inequity and inequality. The things that you're talking about here are things that black people know intuitively, but they don't have the data. You have the data. You have actually studied all of these sections. You studied housing, economics, education, justice, and health. So you've looked at all of the aspects of life. And so when we look at what is going on, say, in the city of Chicago, we see the disparities that you found in your research. And when we look at what happens in terms of Hispanic people and black people, we see that they are not living in the same, they may be occupying the same geography in some cases, although you're pointing out the segregation that still exists. But even being in the same place or being in approximate in some sort of approximation of the same place, does that mean that you're getting the same thing?
Right.
Or anywhere near the same thing, which is what this report is about. So I just thought maybe you just want to start on one of these, on housing, for example, the segregated housing for which we pay the higher interest rates.
Sure.
And have the greater number of foreclosures.
Sure. Yeah, with the housing, you know, we start off by talking about in the report, you can't really talk about housing unless you also talk about segregation. And we chart out exactly how segregation has changed and has not changed over the past half century there. And rather than talking about, you know, there's recent calls for thinking about Chicago in terms of one Chicago. We need to stand firm in terms of solidarity. And while that rhetoric is nice and symbolic, it doesn't necessarily mesh on to the patterns that are documented within this report. For example, we know that by measuring segregation, it's just as segregated now as it was basically in 1970. We know that segregation, racial segregation in Chicago, transcends class boundaries as well. We know that black households that are earning six figures, earning $120,000 or more, are just as likely to be segregated from white households that are than are black lower class households that are earning less than $20,000 a year. We know that you can hold constant a whole number of factors, and race still matters. We know that whenever you have people going out and trying to buy homes, you can hold constant, you know, their credit worthiness, what their credit looks like, what type of house they want to buy. Odds are, if you're black or Latino, you're going to buy a home that comes with a higher interest rate, ballooning payments, extra fees, and all these things add up, especially when you think about you have something that's common in the city, such as racial steering or linguistic profiling, or you have black Latino households that are disproportionately steered towards living within those communities where basically people look like them. And we know that there's a certain stigma that's attached to living in a black or brown community that causes home values to actually depreciate at slower rates, right? Not only at slower rates, but to less value. So we've got black and brown families that are actually paying more for less. And then based on the report that we're seeing this week coming out in the Chicago Tribune, if we put property tax assessments into the picture too, we're seeing that these homes are disproportionately overassessed in terms of what they're valued, meaning that these people are actually having to pay higher rates of property taxes, which go to fund local services, public works, so they're disproportionately paying those things. And those folks are oftentimes the least likely to actually appeal those assessments, oftentimes because they simply don't have the means, right? They're too busy trying to
Or they
get
don't
by.
know they can.
They don't know they can. Meanwhile, you have white households that are the most likely ones to actually appeal these things and pay less assessments. So, yeah, whenever you're talking about housing, we like to think about it going back to what one scholar described it as. Housing is kind of the linchpin of racist relations in America, right? Because it shapes so many factors. It shapes, you know, what access to jobs you have. It shapes what kind of quality of schools your kids can attend. What services you have access to, what health care you have access to. And in a lot of ways, housing seemed like a logical starting point for us because it allows us to have this systemic type of conversation, show that, well, racism in Chicago isn't necessarily isolated within these pockets or these certain areas. And oftentimes, whenever you look at media coverage, we have such a tendency to talk about racism in Chicago as though it only involves like violence or a few bad apple police officers, but really it's a much more systemic type of phenomena that's going on here that needs to be addressed.
Everything is connected to all of these things. Because as you're speaking, I hear everything. One of the things about housing is the insurance. You have to have homeowners insurance, and they can say what they want to say about redlining no longer exists. It does. If the community is a community that has all of the factors that suggest that it is an at-risk community, insurance on property insurance is going to be higher, and that's just a fact. So that it costs more to live indoors if you are black in Chicago than it does if you are not.
Right.
And that's just a fact of life. But then when you look at the thing that you said about healthcare feeds into housing, because you say we're living in healthcare and pharmacy deserts. Well, we already accept that people are living in food deserts. Now you have healthcare deserts and pharmacy deserts added to that, which means that if you cannot access good nutrition to keep yourself well, then you're likely to have all kinds of ailments that require you to get health care. But if health care is inaccessible, then that presents another problem. And then if you get health care, but then you don't have competitive prices for your pharmaceuticals, then that's another kind of discrimination, because you can't afford to go to the only existing one with very little competition to buy whatever the doctor has prescribed.
Absolutely. So in some ways, I think in terms of shifting the narrative and how to have this, like we need to shift the narrative from talking about racial inclusion to talking about racial justice, right? So going off of that healthcare example, we can look at ACA, Obamacare, right? How it did a phenomenal thing in terms of actually improving access to who has healthcare insurance. But like you said, you know, we have about 1 million people who are living on the south and west sides of Chicago that are living in pharmacy deserts, meaning that they don't have a pharmacy within their neighborhood, within a half-mile radius of where they live. And knowing that those communities are also underserved whenever it comes to public transit, what good is health care insurance whenever you can't actually access a doctor?
When you brought up transportation, here's another problem. Not only not having access to public transportation, but if you own an automobile, the insurance rates are going to be higher. The gas prices are going to be higher. And if you can't drive or ride to the places you need to go for services, then you don't have those services, which is why you call them deserts, because there's no oasis. You know, you're just out on the desert with stretches of sand for as far as the eye can see, because there's nothing nearby that you can expect to access to be able to meet your needs.
Right. And we think about that in terms of elderly populations too, and you know, I mean the baby boomers just aging and then being located in those areas of the city without access to that. It's a very urgent problem that isn't being addressed in Chicago at this point. But also, you know, even if someone has access to transit, oftentimes it takes them longer to get to where they actually need to be. Especially if you're living on the south and west sides, the predominantly black neighborhoods in Chicago. I mean, this applies to actually accessing the healthcare providers that you need, the food sources that you need, but also jobs in terms of like looking at commute rates that Chicagoans have.
Right.
We were looking at, okay, well, what is the average commute that a person has to make daily in Chicago? And we found that those living on the south and west sides actually spend a few minutes extra each day, oftentimes because they can't just hop on the red line or the brown line and go straight to the loop and you know, call it a day in terms of getting to and from work. Instead, they have to, you know, hop on a train, hop on a bus, make another transfer, do all these other things. And it's a few minutes each day, but whenever you add that up over the course of a year, we're talking about the typical black worker spends a week longer just to get to work in public transit compared to their white counterpart. And that's a week that you could be spent, you know, it could be spent with family, it could be spent doing leisurely activities, it could be spent doing other things than sitting in transit trying to get to work.
When you talk about that, then it brings up economics. And the thing that stuck out to me was that when you said that it doesn't make any difference how much education, higher levels of education do not eliminate the disparities. In other words, the gap between the income of whites and blacks, the gap between the housing opportunities for blacks and whites, any measure, any indicator that you're looking at will show a gap, and education does not change it. So going to college and getting a degree does not guarantee and certainly does not even suggest that that will make a difference in the quality of your life.
Right.
That you will be living in a place that is conveniently located. They talk about convenience stores, or grocery stores, or food stores in black communities. They're not convenience stores, they're inconvenience stores because they don't sell the things that are essential to people's lives. And consequently, people are living on superficial things that just are used to fill in the blanks between the real thing and what really what they're getting.
Yeah, I mean, that is the flip side of food deserts, right? In some ways, it's food deserts is kind of a misleading term because it implies that there's like absolutely no food there. When in fact, like talking about these convenience stores, there is a lot of food there. It's just a lot of the food that is basically, you know, over time is poisonous to the body. It's foods that are processed, it's foods that are high in saturated fats, it's foods that lead to Chicago's #1 health killer, heart disease and stroke. So, I mean, yeah, it's like folks who are living on the south and west side simply don't have access to supermarkets where they can have access to to fresh produce,
where they can make choices.
Right.
Yeah. One of the things about the ability to make choices is that so much of the choices that would be made are undermined by advertisements. You know, I understand that our community spends a lot more time watching television than, say, other communities do. Well, there is a lot more advertisement than there is entertainment, education, or anything else on television. So consequently, appetites are being formed and influenced. You know, children especially, who are very impressionable, are desirous of having the things that look good and that are touted as tasting good. So what do you have when you step outside your door? You have franchises. Now we have plenty of those. There are franchises everywhere, and you can get food, in quotes. You can get things to eat at franchises at almost less than you can prepare food at home. Somehow I think these franchises must be subsidized, because you can't, if you are making a burger at your house, you can't do it for 59 cents.
Right.
So it's interesting how you can get these foodstuffs at these franchises, and they are everywhere. Now, you can get to one of those very easily. In fact, you can get to one on this side of the street and one on the other side of the street. So it seems as though the colony is a planned environment. It has certain things in it and certain things are not in it. And Eugene Perkins would have called that systematic oppression.
Right.
In other words, it's designed to deprive you of life-giving elements so that you can survive and be productive.
Right. And you know, I could imagine that a lot of folks who would play devil's advocate to that would be like, well, if only they made better choices in terms of what to eat, right? Like if they didn't go to these stores and fill their bodies up with saturated fats, processed foods, they wouldn't be necessarily prone to, you know, heart disease or stroke at disproportionate rates. But you know, what options do you necessarily have, right? It's really hard to pass judgment on a lot of these folks whenever they have to commute longer times to get to work. Oftentimes they're getting paid less, even whenever they're doing the same job than their white counterparts. And then at the end of the day, they come home and actually cook a meal that's going to be more expensive than what they could get at the local fast food restaurant.
And the time, where is the time? If you spend the time commuting, if you spend the time at work, when do you have time to prepare the meal? To go to the grocery store that is miles away, to shop for the groceries, to bring home to prepare for the family. In plantation days, there was a system in which, because the captives were kept at work for so many hours, and they were malnourished and therefore not as productive as they could be, a system was established where one center was established as the kitchen for the plantation. And there were people who were assigned to prepare the meals for the captives who worked. I know you heard the term slaves. I don't use it because I think it's inaccurate. The captives who were working in the fields all day for free, when at the end of the day, could come to the central location and be fed. And rations were apportioned to this central kitchen so that these meals could be prepared and doled out in the quantity and quality that the slave owner declared or decided. It seems that I'm seeing that same thing, because a franchise represents that same to me. It's a central kitchen. It's a kitchen where, if after you have been engaged all day long elsewhere, you can go to, at the moment of the pang of hunger, and satisfy the hunger. Doesn't mean that you're going to do anything nutritionally, but where is the education? Where in the curriculum in the school is the teaching about nutrition, except to talk about, the seven choices of food choices or what have you. You can show those cards to a child all day. If that child cannot see that replicated in his community in a grocery store, then he can't very well make that choice. So if you come up by your bootstraps, pull yourself up, wear your boots.
Right.
How do you make choices that aren't there?
I'm really glad you brought up the whole bootstrapping narrative too, because it kind of it made me think about a point that you brought up earlier regarding middle-class black folks. There's this whole narrative that, well, if you just invest right, if you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, work hard, delay gratification, look toward the future, look towards the future, and all of these great things will happen to you. When in fact, the data is showing that's not the case, even for middle-class black folks, right? We find that middle class for black folks is a double-edged sword. In some ways, yes, they are advantaged vis-a-vis their black poor counterparts, right? They have certain economic advantages that poor black folks don't. But at the same time, compared to their white counterparts, race tends to trump. This is why we can see that, we look at various metrics like unemployment. We see that unemployment rates for black PhDs or black folks who have legal degrees are actually higher than white folks who just have a bachelor's degree and are comparable to some white folks with only some college. And the same applies for poverty rates too. And on the flip side of that, we see that there's less the extreme spoils of inequality of folks who are making really high incomes. You have a situation where you have maybe 1 out of 10 whites with a bachelor degree actually earns an income of over $120,000. Well, if you compare that to black folks, it's only 1 in 50. So it's like the middle class is this very elusive type thing where, where the American dream is a lie.
Well, the middle class, the concept middle class has always given me some pause, because, a middle class suggests that there's a clear delineation between you and that which is not middle class, lower or whatever, and what is upper class. The disparities are so great that it just seems that you have the haves and the have-nots. And some of the have-nots have a little bit more than the other have-nots. But none of the have-nots seem to have enough to be able to lift up their brothers or sisters who are also have-nots. In other words, if you get a good education and get a good job and earn a good salary and live a good life, it will take all that you can muster just to maintain that good life. You cannot do very much except contribute to some causes, make your donations to your church, and those kind of things. You cannot support another family. You cannot support unemployed adult children, but you must, because there's so much. What did you say, 20% unemployment rate in the city? It's greater than that in the black community.
Yeah, 20% for the black community. I think the city of Chicago hovers between 5 and 10.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, thinking about unemployment, like there was almost, you know, a state of emergency called during the peak of the Great Recession whenever the national unemployment was about to reach 10%. Like there were a lot of doom and gloom narratives like, oh my gosh, are we ever going to get out of this recession that we're experiencing? But you look at that from a black perspective, especially a black Chicagoan perspective, their unemployment rate has hovered around 20% for the past, since 1980 at least.
Understand then that the people who are not employed have to be supported, and not everybody qualifies for some sort of welfare or some other kind of help from the state. So that means that the people who are employed are supporting the unemployed. There are children who are home from college who cannot find a job, who are being supported by their families. There are people who had jobs and who lost their jobs because, you know, storefronts closed down, jobs were transferred, you know, whatever the reason, the jobs that they had no longer exist. They haven't been able to find any other jobs. So these people have to be supported. So the employed in the black community have to take on and carry the weight of those who are not employed through no fault of their own. I'm not talking about people that they say don't want to work. I'm talking about people that I know who, like you said, have advanced degrees, cannot only not work in their field, but they can't work in any other field.
Right.
So it's unemployment puts a burden. If you talk about living below the poverty line, when you consider that if you take a single income or two and you're supporting another family or other adults who would be able to be supportive of themselves if they could,
right,
then you understand that that places you squarely below the poverty line, even though on your taxes you can't claim adult children.
Right.
So you can't, you know, you're not going to ever be able to get the real economic story unless you peel back that layer and see who is in that household. Right. Because there are a lot of people in that household who are not employed, who eat, who go here and there, who wear clothes, who have medical issues, and all of that.
Right. And I think that kind of going back to, you know, thinking about racism as this internal colonization that's going on in Chicago, I think that's a really apt description to describe what racism actually is. Oftentimes we have these narratives where, well, if we could just pinpoint certain attitudes, if we could liberalize those and make people think in much more progressive ways about how racial inequality works, well then that racism would go away. But what I hear you talking about, I think actually gets at what racism is. We're talking about racism actually punishes whole communities. Because it's not something that's individualistic. It transcends the individual. It's built into the fabric of the economic and political institutions of the city and country, not the world. It's systematic. Right.
Right. And it's not individualized at all. It targets a whole group, and it's like rain. It falls on everybody in the group. And so when we understand that it's systematic and that it's not accidental and that it is, you know, and that it privileges some people at the expense of other people. And, you know, we could stop being judgmental and talk about what people ought to do if we take away all their ability and all of their opportunity to do what they ought to do. First of all, we have to see what people do when they have the opportunity and the ability to do what they ought to do. When you look back down through history, the history of black people, you can see what they did when they could do what they did. If you look to the pyramids, that is what they could do. You know, if you look to all the laws of medicine and science of every kind, if you look back in the history, you will find black people there doing what they could do when they had the wherewithal to do it. But you cannot cut off a man's legs at the knees and then tell him he ought to walk to some place, you know, without any assistance. But looking at justice, something that what in this report just stuck out about the surveillance, not just the intervention of the police in the affairs of black people, but the surveillance, the huge amount of surveillance under which black people operate. It raised this question with me. If that is so, if we have all this surveillance going on, why is it that we can only see arrests for crimes that black people commit and not arrests for crimes that are committed against black people? If you're always watching these people, then you not only see what they do, but you see what's done to them. Right. Why is it we cannot? 9 people were shot on the west side over the weekend at the same address. We're under surveillance.
Right.
We can't see that was done. We cannot see all of these homicides and shootings that are going on. We can't find the people who are doing these things. There are a lot of guns. We can't find the source of these guns. We can't find the source of these cars that are driving past and shooting people sitting on their porches. Why is it we can't see these things if we have all of the surveillance? What are they looking for and what are they looking at? Yeah. Because clearly they're not looking for criminals. They're looking for people to criminalize.
Right. Yeah, I think it raises serious questions about what is the role of the Chicago Police Department within the city, right? Is it there to serve and protect? Because if it is, well, it would be logical that a lot of those problems would be alleviated. They would kind of go away. But if their role is not to serve and protect, but something else like social control, then I think that's part of your answer right there. A lot of the reasons why these crimes just go unaccounted for is because we need to rethink, well, the function of the police department. And one thing that I would add to that, too, is that, you know, a lot of the violence that is inflicted in communities of color are inflicted by police officers, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Chicago has one of the highest, you know, I guess police killings rates of all the cities within America. Like within the past 5 years, we've had 70 deaths occur on duty. About 2/3 of those have been from the black community.
But who is arming these people?
Who
is arming the people who kill other people?
Right.
I haven't seen a gun factory yet, and I travel all the time.
Right.
So where are these guns coming from? Where is all this ammunition coming from? Where are these vehicles coming from that are never seen again? You know, they just show up one day and somebody fires out a window and then the vehicle disappears. Who is arming the community?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't know. It's not something
taking
that
guns off the street is certainly commendable, but you need to take guns suppliers out of business.
Right.
So that there won't be a source for guns on the street.
Right. I know as a sociologist we would ask, well, what kind of situation, what kind of circumstances would make for that type of environment, right? So I would look towards things like profit motive. There's probably a lot of guns and a lot of cars on the streets like that that are being sent to chop shops because it's very lucrative for some folks. And you could point to, you know, neighboring states. You could point to companies that actually manufacture these guns in terms of pointing to individuals. Yeah, I don't have an answer for you there.
Well, if you can't make it to a food store, I don't know how you get to a neighboring state to buy a gun.
True.
So, you know, there's a disconnect between what is going on and the reasons why it's going on. But, you know, again, when we're talking about all of these things, when we're talking about housing, economics, education, justice, and health, they're all overlapping. And you start talking about one and then you're right back at the others because they all come into play. And most citizens are just interested in how can I provide for my family? How can I keep my children safe? How can I get my children educated? You know, how can I continue to be responsible for my obligations? You know, and in my age group, the concern is how do I manage not to be a burden for my family? Because as you age, the likelihood that you will get some other kind of situation where you require medical care that is extended, as in nursing homes and rehab centers and all that kind of stuff. Elderly black people are in another category from the rest of the population because not only are there fixed incomes, but there are fewer people who are able to support them. Right. You know, when you look at the fiction, you see that most of the time, as people get older, they have the children and the grandchildren who can take care of them and provide for them, and you live in the home of one of your adult children, and they provide for you. But if you have adult children who are unable to take care of themselves, they cannot.
Absolutely.
And if income is so fixed and you don't have affordable health care, then you cannot get quality medical attention. And whatever it is that you may develop, hypertension or whatever it could be, can escalate simply because you're not able to care for yourself and no one else is able to care for you. So it doesn't get better with age. It's not like wine and cheese. As we grow older, the more these problems escalate and the deeper they sink and have roots.
Right. They culminate over time. And it makes me think of, you know, there's a curtain that's raised on racial inequalities in Chicago and the nation, like every few years whenever you have a huge catastrophe kind of happen. And that happened, and talking about, you know, the problems that black elderly in Chicago face, a lot of those were shined light on whenever the 95 heat wave happened, right? Whenever we had 900 or so deaths within the city,
right.
Disproportionately
or
that
when you
affected,
get a cold front.
Or when you, you know, I might get a cold, black folks will probably get pneumonia, right?
Exactly.
As the saying goes. Yeah, with a cold, it could be happening with an economic recession, right? When we think about the wealth disparities in the state of where they are today, we know that prior to the Great Recession, we were looking at about a 10-to-1 ratio between blacks and whites, so meaning that for every $1 that the typical black family possesses in terms of net worth, their wealth, the white family possesses about $10. Well, that jumped up to about a 20-to-1 ratio in Chicago. So much so that you have a third of Chicagoans having zero or negative, a third of black Chicagoans having zero or negative net worth within the city. And even those who do have net worth, about half of them only have enough where they could actually survive at a sustenance level without having an incoming stream coming in, an incoming stream of income coming in for 3 months, meaning that they don't have that much wealth at all. But you're right, it does culminate and it does kind of transcend generations in that respect, because we think about wealth inequalities, and we think about, on the flip side of that, you have white families that have been amassing wealth. Well, whenever they do pass, they're able to transfer that advantage to future generations.
See, I told you we needed to have 2 shows. We're almost within a minute of the end of this show. And I could see that this requires more scrutiny and delving into it deeper. So you have said that at another time you may be available to come back. And I think that it would be good to do another show, in addition to the fact that I don't want to leave the audience thinking that there is no resilience in the Black community, because certainly if we were not a strong people, we would have disappeared. But because of our resilience and because of our determination, we plan to stay, but we don't plan to keep struggling like this, because there's no need to. We live in one of the most affluent nations on the planet, and there's no reason why people who have contributed so much to this particular place should have all the problems that we face, and particularly not in Chicago, because we've been in Chicago for a very long time doing a lot of good for a lot of people.
And being the source of that wealth as well.
Yeah. Here we are. Dr. Margaret Burroughs says, the wealth of nations has been built on the backs of Black people. So what are we doing below the poverty line? What are we doing struggling? What are we doing with an unemployment rate that is allegedly 20% when we know it to be greater? How did we get here? Systematic is what Eugene Perkins calls it. He says it's systematic oppression by design.
Right.
And we need studies like this to help us see the progress so we can curtail it.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Anytime you'll have me back, I would love to take you up on that offer if you'll have me.
I will. See, I told you.
Yeah. We covered a lot of ground.
We did.
And
that's because everything was interlocking.
Yeah.
So, we tried to get in this category, but then in talking about it, you had to go and talk about